So it's always hard to be the last speaker of the day. I'm the only thing between you and drinks, so I'm going to try and keep this as short and conversational as possible. My name is Matt Wallaert. I'm the Chief Behavioral Officer at Clover Health. I've been building products for many years, and I want to suggest that the majority of the time, we actually build products wrong. And what I mean by that is, products exist to change behavior. That is all products in the world, that is their primary function. A chair's job, its function in the world, is to get you to sit down, right? And if it doesn't get you to sit down, it has failed as a chair. But we don't think of our products that way. Too often, product design looks like a bunch of people in a room throwing things at a whiteboard until something makes sense or looks sexy enough. Too often, those people are privileged white males of one kind or another, right? There's no science to it. It's just, that sounds good, we'll go build that. So how do we get to a more scientific version of product? So if we start by believing that the purpose of products is to change behavior, then we have to ask ourselves, how do you change behavior in the world? And so what I want to suggest is that there are very simple scientific models that we can use as product designers to make that easier to do. And I'll suggest a really complicated model that looks like this. What is this? Well, these are promoting pressures, reasons to do something. These are inhibiting pressures, reasons not to do something. And I'll use one of my favorite examples in the world, M&Ms. Why do we eat M&Ms? Sorry, none of my questions are rhetorical. They're actually questions. Why do we eat M&Ms? Presumably you're Russians. You eat M&Ms, yes? Yes, all the time. Okay, so why do we eat M&Ms? They're sweet. That's right. They taste good. And M&M's knows this, right? They just keep churning out flavors. Now, we all know the peanut butter M&M is the pinnacle to which M&M's can aspire, but they just keep making new ones. They released chili pepper M&M's. Why? Do we really need more flavors? They have over 40 flavors at this point. Why? Because taste is a powerful promoting pressure. It's a good reason to eat M&M's. Why else do we eat M&M's? It's not just taste. Why else? Energy, that's a great one. That's one people often miss. Well done, right? Snickers knows this. You've never seen a Snickers commercial that says, Snickers, we taste better than M&Ms, right? That's never happened. Instead, what does Snickers lean into as an advertising campaign? Peanuts for power. You're not yourself if you haven't had a Snickers. They coined the term hangry and really leaned into it. Why? Because of energy. When do M&M consumption peak? When do we eat the most M&Ms? Mid-afternoon. Why? Well, we eat lunch, our blood sugar goes up. Over the course of the afternoon, it bottoms out. We all start to get that little munchy, hungry feeling, and we all go for those high sugar foods. Because why? Energy. Why else do we eat M&Ms? So we have energy and taste. What else? Color. Color's a great one, actually. So as an American, periodically I have to travel to Europe and I get Smarties. And they just look weird. I'm just like, these are wrong. Right? Something in my mind rebels against the sort of weird pastels, right? I like these primary evocative colors. M&M's knows this, by the way. When I was about 20 years ago, there used to be two colors of brown M&M, right? There was like the beautiful chocolate brown M&M, and then there was the weird kind of shit brown M&M, right? And they got rid of the shit brown M&M and it became, does anybody remember? What color it became? No, red was always in there. It was blue. It became blue. But how did it become blue? Well, in America, they let you vote. So people could call in and vote for the new color of M&M. Not even flavor, just color. You know how many people voted? 10 million. 10 million people voted just for the color of M&M. And so as a product designer, right, this is why engineers are really bad at product. They love really logical things. And a logical person would say color doesn't matter, right? Taste matters, but color doesn't matter. Nobody eats M&Ms because of color. But think about the following. We're all serious adults in this room, right? Everybody here is good and, smart and really thoughtful. But every one of us has a favorite color of M&M. But why? We know they're not like Skittles. It's not like that's a different flavor. We're all consciously aware of that. And yet we all have a favorite color. That's what that promoting pressure is, right? They're not always logical, constant things like taste. They can be highly subjective things like color. But they have a very real impact on our behavior. I'm a social psychologist by training, which is really just an excuse to fuck with people. That's all psychology is. It's just fun experiments. And we know that if I give you a bowl of just one color of M&M, you'll actually eat fewer than if I give you the whole mix. It has real effect on behavior, something as illogical as color. So we've got taste, we've got color, we've got calories. What else? Come on, all the marketers in the room, give me one. Brand, yeah, brand is important, right? We all know that they spend millions and millions and millions of dollars with these very cute little animated characters, and like you can go to the M&M store in New York City, right, and get a plushie of an M&M, right? That's brand. Now, we have all these good reasons to eat M&Ms, but look around you. What's happening right now? What behavior don't we see? Nobody's eating M&Ms. But why not? You just told me that they're delicious and caloric and attractive and brand, but nobody's eating anybody. Well, why? Because there's another side of the equation. That's these inhibiting pressures. So what are some inhibiting pressures around eating M&Ms? Why aren't we eating M&Ms? Why are you not eating M&Ms, right? Why are you not eating M&Ms right now? You don't have any. That's right. Availability. Availability is a strong inhibiting pressure, right? I guarantee you want to talk about mind control, right? You want to talk about being a really good product designer? If I sat here and just started throwing M&M packets into the crowd, do you want to bet that some people in the crowd would be eating M&Ms now? Why else? Availability, what else? They're inappropriate, that's right. So that's the flip side of brand, right? Brand tells us, hey, here's some good times to have an M&Ms. You're like at a sports game, or it's like a holiday and they release them in some special colors, or you're like hanging out with your niece or nephew. Those are good M&M brand positive times. But there's a flip side to that. There are brand inappropriate times to meet M&M. We'll talk to Masha over here. It's Valentine's Day. Romantic dinner, candlelight, a little red wine. Exactly. I like that. You see, you and me and Uma Thurman. I like it. And steak, and for dessert, M&Ms. Think Masha's going on a date with me? Probably not. Right? That's a Lindt moment. That's a truffle moment. Right? Branding, as much as it can be a promoting pressure, can also be an inhibiting pressure. There's a time when it's not appropriate. So that's a good inhibiting pressure. So availability is one, brand is one. Come on, there's a really easy one. They're not healthy. I'm getting fatter every day, right? Health is a big inhibiting pressure for them. But what else? Price. They're not free. They're not free. If there were free M&Ms everywhere in the world and they were perfectly available and they were perfectly healthy and they were perfectly on brand, they could probably taste a lot worse. We'd still be eating them. Right? They could still probably not have calories. You'd still be eating them. You wouldn't probably have to spend anything on advertising, right? If they were free and available everywhere. If I could just, everyone had the magic power of just holding up their hand and M&Ms just appeared, right? Everyone all day long just, right? So when you think about building a product and trying to change behavior, you actually have two levers. It's not just promoting pressures. There's also these inhibiting pressures on the other side. And it turns out that human beings, as part of our psychology, predictably get this wrong. We will, as product designers, traditionally focus on promoting pressures long before we will get to inhibiting pressures. So your job as a product designer is actually to create a process that forces us to be more rigorous about balancing those pressures. So how do you actually do that? I want you all to change your behavior. The goal of this talk, just like any product, is to get you to change your behavior. And so I want you, when you go into the office tomorrow, or the next day, since we still have another day of conference, to sit at a whiteboard and draw an up arrow and a down arrow, and start to think about your own product. What are all of the reasons that people would use your product in the first place? And what are all of the reasons they're not already using your product? Does that make sense? Yes? Good? Are we there? I know I'm speaking fast. And you're all tired. I'm getting no feedback. Does that make sense? Yes, okay, he's like, that guy believes it makes sense, so we're moving on. Now, it's not just those pressures. Because if all products exist to change behavior, we have to know what behavior we're trying to change. So another key step for you as a product designer is to think about writing something called a behavioral statement. What is a behavioral statement? A behavioral statement is a picture of what the world will look like, a description of what the world will look like when your product is successful. Right? Let's take Uber. Right? Let's take Uber. Uber was massively successful in a market where others have not been because they focused on inhibiting pressures. What do I mean by that? Well, back when Uber started, it was in the US and it was black cars, right? Fancy cars that would pick you up mostly from the airport. That's where they started. Now, there were lots of competitors in the black car space at the time. And they all were trying to focus on promoting pressures. It's not going to be a black car. It's going to be a silver Audi. And it's going to be driven by Claudia Schiffer and have a disco ball and play your music. And, just candy will rain from the sky in the back of this silver Audi, right? Everyone else was focused on how do you make it better. What did Uber do? They just made it easy. Yeah, they just tried to make it easy. This, by the way, for the marketers in the room, this is why product and marketing have to marry each other. You have to be lock in step. If you look at your early Uber marketing campaigns, email campaigns, they only sent 3 kinds of emails. It is now cheaper than it ever was before. There are now more drivers on the road, so you'll be able to get one faster. Or we can now go somewhere we couldn't go before. We couldn't go to the airport, now we can go to the airport. We couldn't go to this, now we can go to that. Right? They were very religious about focusing on the inhibiting pressure. Nobody in the world thought payment was an inhibiting pressure. And then Uber comes along and removes payment. You can just get into the cab and get out of the cab and never have to pay. This is a real problem for those of us that live in New York City. Sometimes I take a real cab and I forget that I actually have to pay and can't just get out again. I have this tendency to just get out of the cab. The cab driver's like, you do need to swipe a card and do some stuff. And I forget because I now live in a world where that inhibiting pressure has been removed, courtesy of Uber. So how did Uber get there? Well, let's take a behavioral statement and we'll use Uber as our example. So the first thing you need is behavior statement is a motivation. When people, that's your population, Uber's really has a special population. Most of the time, I hate it when entrepreneurs, I do a lot of funding, right? Entrepreneurs come to me and I'm like, who's your product for? And they're like, everyone. I'm like, no, it's not. If your product is for everyone, you are guaranteed to fail. But Uber, magical creation that they are, actually was pretty much for anybody. I'm pretty sure that if a chicken had figured out how to get an order in Uber, they would have driven him across the road like that. They would have been like, fine, get in. Right? They're very happy to take sort of anyone, anywhere. So when a population wants to motivation, what is the motivation for taking an Uber? Why does anyone take an Uber anywhere? Well, it's convenient, but wait. This is where inhibiting and promoting pressures different than motivation. Motivation is that core reason we do something in the first place. You have to want to go somewhere. There is no reason to take an Uber if you don't want to binarily go somewhere. It's a 0-1 world. Either I need to go somewhere and I don't need an Uber, or I need to go somewhere and I do. Does that make sense? So when people want to go from point A to point B, and they have some limitations. What are the limitations of Uber? You have to have the app, right? You have the app, which means you have to have the phone, which means you have to have connectivity. I am on T-Mobile, which is currently giving me 2G speeds here in Russia. It's amazing. I have to wait a really long time to get an Uber. Maybe this app will eventually load. And I can't use the regular Uber app because, of course, they got bought by Yandex. So now it's like, yes, download this Yandex app. I'm like, great, 45 minutes while this Yandex app downloads, right? Connectivity is a very real limitation. You guys actually can do something here in Russia with an Uber that we cannot. There's something you can do in Russia that you cannot do in the US. Does anybody know what it is? Pay by cash. There you go. Pay by cash. So in the US, pay by cash is a limitation. In order to use Uber, you have to have an electronic form of payment. You have to charge it to a credit card or debit card. It will not let you pay with cash. Well, this may not seem like a big deal, but when Uber launched, only about 70% of the US population had an electronic form of payment. So 30% of the population couldn't use it by default. So these limitations become incredibly important. Now Uber, in order to expand into other markets, has actually eliminated some of those limitations by, for example, allowing you to pay in cash in some markets. right? They've actually changed their limitations because they become so big. So when a population wants to motivation and they meet these limitations, they will behavior. What is the behavior? What is Uber's behavior? What do they want you to do? Yeah, take an Uber, right? Do the thing that is taking an Uber. That's what they want you to do. They want you to take an Uber. And how do they measure that? As measured by what? Rides. Rides is the unit of measurement for Uber. So in addition to writing a promoting pressure arrow and an inhibiting pressure arrow, I want you to think about writing a behavioral statement, a very clear articulation of what your product is actually supposed to get people to do in the world. It needs a population and a motivation. You need to understand what limitations exist. You need to measure what behavior it is and how you're going to measure that behavior. This last point is really, really key. One of the things that Uber has going for it is that it's a complete closed loop, right? The behavior that is ordering and taking a car generates the data that allows the measurement of that behavior. But that is not always true. Think about M&Ms. This is a massive, massive problem for M&Ms. How do M&Ms get sold in the world, right? I'm Mars. I'm a maker of M&Ms. I ship a giant, sort of truck full of M&Ms to some depot somewhere. It then gets carved up into smaller and smaller bits and passed around and passed around and passed around. So by the time it gets to your local 7-Eleven, they have literally no idea that those M&Ms are there. And when you buy a package of them, they have no way of getting that data back. In real time, with any fidelity, Mars cannot tell you how many M&Ms they sold yesterday. Uber can tell you with 100% accuracy how many rides somebody took a minute ago. That's a huge competitive advantage, right? Because it means they can deploy experiments in real time. Let's say you're Mars, and you want to change people's M&Ms eating behavior. Well, if it takes you 3 months to get your data back, that's a huge lag time for every experiment that you want to run. And so if you think of yourselves as product designers, as part of your job to be about the cycle of running experiments to change behavior, measurement, how quickly you can measure and how quickly you can iterate on those experiments is key. So remember I said earlier, hey, it's really incredibly important that you kind of lockstep with your marketing partner. You also need to be lockstep with your data scientists. Your ability to be a good product person, to run experiments and iterate on what you do, depends on your ability to measure those experiments, which means you need to be in lockstep with your data scientists. You also need to be in locksteps with your qualitative researchers, your user researchers, or for many people, customer service. Customer service is the quickest, see, I bored her. Goodbye. Customer service is the best way to get live feedback about whether the thing that you are doing is working. If you look at Clover Health and our behavioral change team, it's a triad of people that works together as a team. It's one project manager, one quant, and one qual. And we run a very specific 10-week process. Now, does that mean that you should use that same triad or that you should use that 10-week process? Not necessarily. What I want to encourage you to think about is that if science is your process and behavior is your outcome, you are, by definition, a behavioral scientist. This is making sense so far? Yes? Yes? Great. Okay, so couple of little gotchas. One I already talked about. We have a tendency as human beings to focus on promoting pressures. As product designers, our tendency is to gravitate towards how do we get people to do something rather than how do we make it easier. So how do we get around that? Well, there's a couple of tricks you can do. One, you can write the inverse of your behavioral statement. What if you tried to design something that would never work? It would be the opposite of working. How would you make somebody never take an Uber? That thought experiment of how to make somebody never, ever, ever take an Uber is actually really, really valuable. It is a great way to start to get yourself out of the promoting pressure trap and to start to think about your inhibiting pressure. How would you destroy your own business? Right? If you were your competitor, what would you do to make sure that nobody ever used your product? So that's one way to get around it. I actually love inhibiting pressures for several reasons. There's a couple special things about them. For one, inhibiting pressures tend to be homeostatic, whereas promoting pressures tend to be heterogeneous. What do I mean by that? Well, M&Ms, you're eating them because they're pretty, and you're pretty, but they're pretty, right? You're eating them because you need some energy, right? You're eating them because they're delicious, because you have some flavors. They all want them for different reasons. But they're all not eating them right now because they're not available. And they're all affected by price, and they're all affected by brand. Inhibiting pressures tend to be broadly applied across the whole population, whereas promoting pressures tend to vary person by person. Does that make some sense? That's one of the reasons I love focusing on inhibiting pressures. There's another hidden thing about inhibiting pressures that I love. If we focus only on promoting pressures, everybody in this room is in competition with each other. Everybody in this room is with competition with each other. Because to a behavioral scientist, there's only one unit that really matters, and it's not money and it's not time, it's mental attention. I don't know about you, I'm getting dumber every day. I have a little less mental attention every day, and it's getting eaten up by 1,000 little things, right? If you look at app usage on a phone, people's app usage is very static. You can only use between 10 and 15 apps. And so if you install a new app and start to actively use it, one of the others falls off. Well, what does that mean? That means that everybody in this room that has an app is competing with everybody else that has an app, because every time yours starts getting usage, theirs goes down. The secret of inhibiting pressures is it gets us out of that world. It gets us out of competition with each other. Because if what I'm trying to do is lower the barriers to using something, instead of trying to take up more of your mental energy, I'm trying to take up less. In a perfect world, Uber would use none of my mental energy. Right? I would never think about transportation. I would just, wherever I wanted to go, I would walk out of where I was. A car would magically appear. It would detect through sensors that I had left the building. It would know from my calendar where I intended to go next. I wouldn't think about it at all. Isn't that a magical product, right? One that drives our attention to zero. This was a big revelation for Facebook. The first 10 years or so of Facebook, they were religiously, they just focused on how do we get more of your attention? How do you spend more time? I hate time on site or time in app as a metric. It's a terrible metric. It's a terrible metric. Because if you take it to the extreme, and I always recommend taking things to the extreme to sort of pressure test them, what that says is I would do nothing in my life but be on Facebook. Well, that's a real problem for Facebook. Facebook bought Instagram, right? Huge property for them. Instagram requires you to what? What do they need people to do? Take photos, right? There's a behavior that is take photos. That's what Instagram needs from you. Well, guess what you can't do? You cannot simultaneously read Facebook and take Instagram pictures at the same time. Or if you did, it would be incredibly boring, right? Those behaviors compete with each other. What Facebook started to realize that that everyone spent all of their time on Facebook and they spent no time doing anything else, they would have nothing else to talk about. There'd be no pictures, there'd be no posts, there'd be nothing new in the news feed, because it would all just be the same regurgitated timeline over and over and over again. So they started to change their product strategy to encourage people to actually get out into the world and do things, because they recognized that was important for their business model. They needed people to actually go and participate in the world. So what I would suggest to you is, by focusing on inhibiting pressures, by removing all of those things that keep us from doing something, you actually get out of this trap where you're competing with everybody else in the room all of the time. Does that make sense? So they're homeostatic. I love that. I love that they get us out of competition with each other. The other thing that's true is almost all of your competitors, because of that natural tendency to focus on promoting pressures, they're all looking down here. And what's the golden rule of business? If you can look where no one else is looking, there's probably something there, right? Uber won by doing the opposite of what everyone else was doing. Everyone else was going after promoting pressures. They looked at inhibiting pressures and found success. I'm willing to bet for some of you in this room, for the things that you're building, if you start to focus on inhibiting pressures, you'll find, hey, my competitors are really only looking down here. And there's usually lots of unmet opportunity up here. Now this, by the way, can be flip-flop. Some of you will build things that are about eliminating behaviors, getting people to eat less, right? Getting people to do anything less. Stop smoking is a really great example. Smoking is one of the great sort of successes of American public health, right? The smoking rate went from a point in the mid-70s where basically every adult American smoked to a point now where very few do, less than sort of about 5%, right? How did they do that? Well, they put in place strong inhibiting pressures, right? They did what everyone naturally does. If you want people to stop doing something, you punish them, right? Inhibiting pressures. It's just the opposite of our tendency to focus on promoting pressures when we want somebody to do something more. So they put in place high taxes, and they ran advertisements about how they'll kill you and put big labels on here. I'm sure these same things work in Russia, right? You know, you'll all get lung cancer and die. We'll make them really expensive, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what? And those worked to an extent. But you know what really worked in America? You can't advertise cigarettes. It's one of the few products in America that you are legally barred from advertising. You can't advertise them in magazines, on television. Joe Camel, remember Joe Camel? Did that make it over here? We actually outlawed Joe Camel. I really like this idea. I like a bunch of adult senators sitting around passing a law being like, you can't use cartoon characters, right? They got religious about removing the promoting pressures, the reasons people do things in the first place. If you want people to eat less, you can spend all of your time putting barriers to eating, or you can just eliminate the reasons that they're doing it in the first place. There are always those things inside of our app. There's always inside of the product you build, there are things you're like, man, I wish people would stop doing that. And so often people just put in gateways. Well, people keep clicking on this setting and I really don't want them to, so I'll hide it. I'll put it deeper in the thing so only like the really dedicated people find it. And that works, sort of. But you fail to ask the primary question. Why were they clicking it in the first place? Right? What was the promoting pressure that was causing that to occur? Is this making some sense? Yeah. Great. There's no clock, so I'm just going to keep rambling on. I'm also going to do Q&A in a second, so prepare your questions now. And then, you know, if we end early, I'm just saying there might be drinks earlier. I like that you're laughing. I appreciate you, sir. Everyone else back there, this far back there and the far back there asleep, but you are on it. Couple things that I want to talk about. The most powerful pressures that you will forget to think about is identity. Identity. We often refuse to put that up on the board. But I'll tell you the story about my mom. My mom I'm from very rural Oregon. I don't know if you see this cowboy boots, big belt buckle, right? I'm a cowboy. I grew up in a very rural place. My mom, she's a tough lady. She's a nurse. And, you know, she was not given to high emotion. I don't know what that means, but you're waving it at me. I'm halfway there, she says. Okay, halfway. You're almost halfway done with me. So, my mom not given to big swings of emotion, but when I was a kid, there was a reliable way to get my mom to cry, and that was to try and get her to use a computer. I feel like I could have like chased her around with a mouse, and she would have been like, ah, right? Not a real mouse, that she would have been like, get that out of here. But like a computer mouse, she'd just freak out. This is not her thing. So my mom was a floor nurse in a hospital for many, many years, about 40 years. But you know what my mom did at the end of her career? The last 10 years of her career? Nursing informatics. Yep, she was in charge of computers for all of the nurses. What the fuck? Right? Here I am, I'm like, man, when I was a kid, I tried to get you to use these things, and all you did was cry, and now you run the computing department. How'd that happen? Well, it turns out I'm an idiot, which, by the way, is usually the answer. I'm an idiot. How did I try and get my mom to use computers? Well, I talked about the things that were important to me. Look how powerful they are. Look how future forward they are. Look how interesting they are about how they work, right? All of these things that were very important to me. But my mom grew up in a time when women weren't highly involved in computing. She didn't go to college. She didn't think of herself as well educated. All of the brand, all of the identity built around a computer were inhibiting pressures for her. So what did her hospital do? They changed the way she thought about computers. So I had focused on all of the things that I thought were really great about computers, power and speed and sort of efficiency and all these things that appealed a lot to me. Do you know what the hospital said to my mom? They said, you really care about saving people and helping people be healthy. This is a tool to do that. They paid no attention to the idea of them as computers or any of the things that triggered the negative identity, the inhibiting identity for her. Instead, they found an identity that worked, a promoting identity. You want to help people? This is just a tool to help people. And that worked. I guarantee you, if you go into the office on Wednesday, after you've drawn your promoting and inhibiting pressures and written out your behavioral statement, make sure that there are identity statements on the promoting side and on the inhibiting side. What identity does someone have to have in order to get to use your product, and what thing will keep them from using your product, and how can you systematically address those? UI designers in the room, this is where you come in all the time. I think UI and UX is a great way of priming identity. Because often, the same system can be used by very different people in very different ways. I often talk about the sort of like machine gun samurai sword problem. So take like security software. It's a really good example, security software. At the base level, all security software does essentially the same sort of thing. Someone in the security room who's a security person can yell at me for that, but it's essentially true, right? All security software operates in the same way, and yet the UI is very different. There are two kinds of UIs for security. One is the security that almost all of us have on our computers, right? You press a button, it scans files, it sort of works automatically. It's like the machine gun version. Press this button, go, you can just mow things down, right? It appeals to people who don't think of themselves as skilled about security, right? That's what I want. I want a fire and forget it solution because I don't know anything about security. I just want something that works. But imagine if you're a security professional. Same underlying system, but you want a UI that's like a samurai sword. You know, completely useless on the modern battlefield, but in the hands of a skilled warrior, right? It's perfect. Identity plays into almost everything that we build. I'll give you another. How many people in the room are building consumer products, something for the B2C market? Oh, great, a lot of you. Okay, so great, let's talk about consumer identity. Here's this fundamental paradox, right? We can talk about snowflakes in a blizzard. It turns out to be true that if you don't feel special and unique, you get depressed. You have to feel special. Instagram has shown this very well. Everybody wants to be liked. Everybody wants to be unique. Everybody wants those retweets. Conversely, if you don't feel part of a group, if you don't feel like you found your tribe, people who share an identity with you, you get depressed. Well, this is sort of a problem. Somehow, I need to magically, all of us in the consumer space, make people feel unique and special, but also part of a group. So there's another way of thinking of this. We often talk about stable and unstable likers and dislikers. You know, I'm a scientist, right? So everything's a 2x2 matrix. So I am a stable liker of Johnny Cash. What does that mean? I like Johnny Cash when he was popular. I like Johnny Cash when he wasn't popular. So when Walk the Line came out and everybody else really liked Johnny Cash, great. Congratulations, welcome to the fold. When that trailed off and they watched some other movie, that's fine. I'll still be here liking Johnny Cash. I'm a stable liker of Johnny Cash. Now there are stable dislikers of Johnny Cash. Some of you in the room may really not like Johnny Cash. You don't like country music. You're like, the epitome of American, sort of hickdom, right? That doesn't sound good on the ear. I'm not going to listen. Stable dislike. There may be real reasons for that. You may really like a different kind of music. It doesn't appeal to you. It may have nothing to do with what other people think. It just doesn't hit your ear right. Those are stable dislikers. Now, there are unstable likers, right? People who like Johnny Cash only for a moment when everybody else does. And then there are unstable dislikers, often referred to as hipsters. Do you have them here in Russia? You have hipsters here in Russia, right? They don't care about something, and then everybody else likes it, and they're like, fuck that thing. I hate that thing, whatever that thing is that other people like. It's terrible, right? They don't care about Starbucks, and then Starbucks becomes popular, and they're like, fuck Starbucks, right? You're like, you didn't care about that like 5 minutes ago, right? Well, why do those exist? Because those people are resolving the paradox we just talked about, right? The people on the stable side are talking about their specialness. I especially like Johnny Cash. I especially don't like Johnny Cash. But it's unique to me. It's part of who I am as a person. These unstable people are trying to join a group, right? They're trying to say, hey, other people are doing this thing or not doing this thing, and I want to be like them, and so off I go with that group. Those are the single most powerful promoting and inhibiting pressures that I know. So if you're not looking at systematically how your product is talking to the identity of people, then you're not doing your job as a product designer. You're not looking hard enough at the promoting and inhibiting pressures that guide our behavior. So how do you actually do that? Well, what do you do with stable likers? What do you do with a stable liker as a product person? Talk to them, because they know your product better than you do. Right? I could give you long, detailed opinions about Johnny Cash. I can talk to you about how on the American records, one of the best songs at the end of the last American record is We'll Meet Again. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. But if you listen, it's a duet between Johnny Cash and his wife, June Carter Cash. And what you know if you're a stable liker is you know that shortly after that song is recorded, June will die. She's already been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And that shortly thereafter, John will die. And as the whole family joins in for the last chorus, you can hear them all singing about the fact that they know their parents are going to die, but that they're certain they will see them again in heaven. Now that's a stable liker conversation. That's a deep conversation about Johnny Cash's music and what it meant to him and what it means to me. That's the kind of conversation you want to have with stable likers. You want to get in a room as a product designer with those people who know more about your product than you do and really talk to them about what fits their identity and what they want to see and hear out of it. Now, what I would suggest to you is that unstable likers are actually useful, stable dislikers are useful in the same way. When you're talking about mapping out the promoting and inhibiting pressures, actually figuring out how to draw those arrows, you need to be talking not only to the people who are using your product, but who are reliably not using your product. Who has never tried it, but not tried it's a hard sentence, not tried it because they don't know about it. Right? That's not a stable disliker. They don't have any dislike for your product. They just don't know about your product. Instead, how do you seek out the people who know exactly what your product is and have made a conscious and disciplined choice not to use it? They have just as much to tell you as stable likers do. You need to look at their data. You need to have conversations with them qualitatively because they can tell you deep insights about your product. If you go to Johnny Cash, if someone says, I don't listen to Johnny Cash because I think he's derivative of earlier blues musicians, hey, that can tell him something. It can say that he needs to pay homage to those people. It can help him mold what he does in the world. Now, what about unstable likers? Unstable likers are your best friends. And why are they your best friends? Because here's the trick about stable likers. Remember, this is about my unique identity, right? The promoting pressure for me is about my special snowflakeness. And so what that means is, while I can talk extensively about Johnny Cash, I'm never actually going to convince you to listen to Johnny Cash, because I don't care, right? It doesn't matter to me how many of you listen to Johnny Cash, because it's about me. It's not about all of you. Unstable likers, in contrast, they want everybody else to come along too. That's their whole job, right? Their whole job is to recruit an entire tribe of people to come with them, come with me. They are your essential growth hack for spreading whatever it is you're spreading. And you can see the difference. I love looking at Twitter. Because you can use @ in two ways at Twitter, right? If they come at the beginning, it doesn't pop up on anyone's notification feed. You're talking directly to a brand. @ Matt Wallaert, looking forward to seeing you today. The only people that see that, right, are me and that person. Do you think that person's trying to recruit other people to like Matt Wallaert? No. They're a stable liker. They're talking directly to me. They want to engage directly with me as the product. But when someone says, hey, I'm really looking forward to seeing @ Matt Wallaert at ProductSense today, that person is recruiting. That person is trying to say, hey, I'm cool. I'm going to ProductSense. I know who this Matt Wallaert guy is. Not really, but okay. I know who that Matt Wallaert guy is. They're recruiting actively people into a movement. And then we have our final quadrant, unstable dislikers. What do you do about unstable dislikers? What do you do with hipsters? Well, I'll have the controversial opinion of you make fun of them. I actually think this is I shit you not, I actually think that's the appropriate way to handle them. Because here's the thing. They're going to move on anyway, right? When you fall out of the limelight, when you're no longer relevant for them, they're going to move on. But in the meantime, you can actually talk about your brand by pointing to who's not about it. My favorite example of this was there was sort of a prankster on Facebook. And he made a fake account, and he pretended to be Target's customer service. He pretended to be Target's customer service. And Target had just made the somewhat controversial decision to no longer separate boys' toys and girls' toys, but to collapse them together and to say, hey, you know what? Toys are toys. And it doesn't matter if you're gender. You can play with whatever toy you want. And there were some people, some right-wing, stupid, idiotic Trump kind of people, who thought this was a really bad idea. They were like, no, there are girls' toys and there are boys' toys, and you don't mix the two. Those gender people, you do your thing, right? They were very angry, and so they wrote into Target, and they were very angry on Target's Facebook page. Why do you do this thing? And gender is blah, 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 right? They were very angry about this. And so this guy just started making fun of them, right? He just started making fun of them. And they were brilliant. No one ever responds, right? Because you've been totally shut down by this very interesting person that's sort of like taking the piss out of your thing. Right? There was somebody, my favorite one, somebody was very angry. They were like, I went to Target the other day and they didn't fucking speak English. They were speaking Spanish and goddamn, it's America. We speak English in America. And the guy wrote, don't you wish you spoke more than one language? Right? And like the first person's thing, nobody gave a shit about that. His response, just massive virality, right? Make fun of your unstable dislikers because they're not valuable to you. They're not giving, stable dislikers are giving you valuable feedback. They're telling you something real about your product. Unstable dislikers are just taking the piss, right? They're just trying to get attention. And one of the worst mistakes you can make as a product designer is to confuse your promoting and inhibiting pressures because you take something that an unstable disliker or an unstable liker says and you build around it because you think that's what matters. They're going to move on, regardless of what happens with your product. They're going to move on because they're just surfing the wave of popularity. And so when you build for them, you build features that you will throw away. Now, sometimes that makes sense for stable or unstable likers, right? I know this isn't going to be a permanent part of how I do things, but I want to appease you because I want you to go recruit some other people, right? And so I'll build this sort of throwaway feature. But for the engineers in the room, that should be the ugliest code you've ever written because you're not keeping it, right? That feature will very quickly go away when those people move off, right? I actually love to structure product teams this way. For those of you that are in big enough companies to have multiple product teams or multiple product people, I actually like to align them again, one against each of the three groups. Hey, your job is to build features that make it easier for unstable likers to recruit more people. Go build throwaway features that help us grow. Hey, your job is to talk to stable likers and understand at a deep level what keeps them in the product, how they want us to grow in the long-term future, why they're going to subscribe and keep paying us a subscription fee. And your job is to go find those stable dislikers and understand what are they so objective about? What are they so angry about? And how do you actually address that at a root cause in our thing? And it may be totally legitimate. And those are convertible. Does that start to make some sense? All right. Hard. It's really hot up here, and it's the last thing of the day, and this is my third country, so I'm a little tired right now. I think we should do some Q&A. How do people feel about that? Yeah, good. All right. Does anyone have a question? If not, I swear I'll just keep rambling at you, and you won't like that. Yes, sir. The one guy in the audience who's still awake.
Раз.
Ta-da. Ta-da. Ta-da.
Hello.
Hey.
That's a great speech.
Thank you.
I really love the idea of that framework with that quadrants. That's great. And how to marry this with customer development process, with innovating the product, because when you ask people like that, what you need, they say, I need a faster horse. They will never say, I need a car.
Right.
So how to marry this whole thing?
Yeah, 100%. So how do you actually bring this into your product discovery? I think there's a couple of things. If you have access to massive data, you can do it lexically. So they actually literally talk differently. So we've done semantic analysis inside of comments, and you can actually see that stable likers are talking differently, unstable likers are talking differently. If you're, for example, a big enough product that there's a Reddit channel devoted to you, right? Reddit is an amazing place to get all of these quadrants of people, and you can actually tease out what they are programmatically. If you're in a smaller setting and you're doing sort of upfront product research, one of the things is just being conscious of it. So I actually ask people on my team to identify, hey, okay, I did a customer interview with Sam. Sam was a stable liker, right? Here's why I knew he was a stable liker, right? It's that classification that allows you to start to see the trends. Because as I said, one of the biggest mistakes that people tend to make is they'll just put likers and dislikers. Right? And so when you mix your stable and unstable likers together, you get really trash features out of it, right? Because your unstable likers are loud as hell, right? That's why, by their very nature, they're really excited about your product, right? I don't sound excited about Johnny Cash, right? When I told you the story about, Let's Meet Again, that's not an excited story, it's a deep story, right? But when you mix deep and excited together, you get startlingly bad things. And so I think just teasing apart those quadrants is actually the most important part of customer discovery, is understanding who are we actually talking to here. I think people underinvest in who is giving the feedback in customer discovery, right? They just take all their customer discovery and they like pile it together. I'm virulently anti-persona. I don't like personas for the reason that they're they're inorganic, right? You start giving the person a name and lumping together other things about them that don't always hold true. But I am very much about bucketing people by like, where they fit in those 4 quadrants. So in product development, that's sort of where I go. I will say, we are, at least at Clover, and I generally think this is true in the world, we have a very strict product of pilot, test, scale. So what are pilots? Pilots for us are when we do very minimal customer discovery, about 2 weeks worth of talking to people, and our customer discovery is really focused around revealing those pressures. Right? I'm not trying to understand the person so much, or will they buy my product. I'm trying to understand what governs their existing behavior. They're doing something now, why? Right? And I try and tease out those promoting and inhibiting pressures. It takes about 2 weeks. And so then we try and get to a pilot. A pilot is literally the lowest fidelity thing that you can do, right? To see if you can change behavior, whether it's worth doing something at all. Don't look for statistical significance. Statistical significance is a red herring, right? It requires a large population, and if you have a population large enough that you are getting statistical significance, you're betting too heavy. You should be betting much more lightly than that. Our pilots, 20, 50 people, very small, right? Just literally find anything that seems like it has any prayer of working. Then and by the way, we do that entirely within the behavioral science team. So no code, we code a little bit ourselves, but you hack it together entirely yourself, right? Because inevitably, if you go out to engineering and you say, hey, build me this thing so that I can pilot it, they'll get really tired of you, right? And you'll lose that ability to do that. You have to do it entirely within the resources of the product team, right? They should be as low fidelity as possible. If something works, right? So for the statisticians in the room, our values are high. Doesn't matter if it's statistically significant, but it looks like it has an effect size that might matter. Then we do a test. So instead of 50 people, it's 500 people, right? And here's where we start to say, what would it actually take to do this for real, right? In a pilot, you should never ask yourself, well, is this possible, right? You should never ask yourself how many hours of engineering it would take to build. Those aren't the conversations you have in pilot. Pilot is about, is this even a good idea in the first place, right? Then at test, that's where you start to say, is the juice really worth the squeeze, right? Is it really something that is worth the sort of investment? And then scale is what it sounds like, right? Building it into your product, really making it things. But if you do this properly, by the time you arrive at scale, then your business leaders have a very concrete decision to make, because you can give them a sentence that sounds something like, if you do X, you get Y. Now, they may not green light it. They may say, hey, X and Y don't work out in the master strategy of us as a company. But at least you've given them something where they have relative fidelity about what the trade-offs they're making are. This is the biggest problem for CEOs in the room, right? Your product people come to you and they're like, we have this thing that works. And you're like, well, what's the probability that it'll work and how hard is it to do? And they don't really know. They just want to build a thing, right? They're like, we've fallen in love with this idea, and so we want to build this idea, right? You have to get to this place of being really religious about sort of what promoting and inhibiting pressures are being changed. And the reason for that, and the reason we draw this out, I will tell you, all the people in the product world, we just don't use enough structure. Right? Too much stuff just looks like whiteboarding. If you actually write out promoting and inhibiting pressures and you say, the reason we are doing this pilot is because we are trying to change this pressure, you actually get some surprising things out of that. So for example, let's say you have a pressure that is, you think cost really matters. You think cost is a dominant inhibiting pressure. So you try thing A, B, and C. Well, if A, B, and C don't work, what you've probably learned is that cost is not as big of a driver as you thought. But if A and B work and C doesn't, then you know, hey, cost really does matter. It's just C is a broken intervention. C is not a good idea. Does that make sense? But it's that alignability. If you're not aligning them against pressures, then you're just trying experiments. The example I always give is, you're do you do an A/B test, red button or blue button? But you have no idea why red or blue would be good or bad. You're just like, red button, blue button. Well, the only thing you learn from that is that blue was better than red. What about green? What about yellow? Now you have to test every single color, right? But if you said, hey, red is it's really about attention. and it turns out some of these colors are better at attention than other colors, then you're really just trying to find the color that does attention, right? And you have something reliable that you've learned and can use. Does that make sense? It's a long-winded answer, but does that that's how you we bucket it at least, right? Really getting religious about that product experience. All right, any other questions besides the alert guy in the front room? We'll go here, let's go to this young lady and then we'll go right back to here to this young gentleman.
Thank you very much. I am wondering, what do you think about all jobs to be done thing?
Look, here's what I would tell you. I care about outcome. I'm an outcome-focused leader, not a process-focused leader. I don't know if these 4 quadrants are the right quadrants, where like promoting and inhibiting pressures are the right way to get people to do product. What I care about is that people do product in a methodical way, right? In a way that drives behavioral outcomes that actually work in the world and minimizes the waste that we encompass along the way. So what I would say about jobs to be done, and I know Clay, and he's a good guy, the things I would say about jobs to be done is if that metaphor, if that process works for you, meaning it gets you to a place where you're sort of repeatedly building things that drive behavior change, great, use it. I have a book coming out in June, and the very beginning of the book is, everything in this book is a suggestion, right? It's what's worked for me and for other people that I've taught. Does that mean it's the best thing in the world? No. You should go make your own version. You should customize it. For example, our product development is 10 weeks. We have a very strict 10-week cycle. Week 1 is writing a behavioral statement. Week 2 is quants and quals go off and do research. Week 3, they cross-validate. So meaning the quant tries to see if what the qual found is verified in the data, and the qual tries to see if what the quant found in the data bears out in real life, right? So cross-validation. Week 4 is a pressure mapping, right? This inhibiting pressure, promoting pressure. Week 5 is actually intervention design, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are running and testing the intervention. Now, does that mean everyone in this room should use a 10-week cycle? No. Some people are going to use an 8-week cycle. We used to use an 8-week cycle, and it turned out not to work for us. We like a 10-week cycle better. Some people who do 12 weeks, right? That's going to work better for you. So what I would say is find the system that works for you, but use a system, right? Where product goes to die is when we just start like going off of opinions. I became a social psychologist in a very specific way. I was in college, and I was in a psychology class, and we read a paper. And I didn't disagree with the data, but I disagreed with the interpretation that the authors made on top of the data. I thought they were overreaching. And my professor said the greatest thing that any teacher can say to anyone. He said, the field agrees with these people, but this is science. And so you can go run your own experiments and have a conversation with them through data, through experimentation. And that's what product should really be about, right? If you find product to end up being someone's opinion versus someone's opinion, you're doing it wrong. Right? If it's just opinion versus opinion, we should all fucking go home, right? You only need one product person, and that person just like throws shit at a wall and decides shit, and then you're done, right? For any large-scale thing, anything with more than one person, anything where we want to get away from just opinions, there has to be process. And so if you use a process that is jobs to be done, and you have data that backs up what those jobs are, and the use of those jobs creates a product that changes behavior, God bless. Does that make sense? This young gentleman back here.
Thanks, Matt. Awesome speech. A question about the inhibiting pressure. Would you say that there are certain periods in product life where it is more, important to think about inhibiting pressures for this particular product, or is it something that like a concept that you should always keep in mind?
I think you should always keep it in mind, but I think you're absolutely right. There are periods when it matters more than others. I think you have to start with promoting pressures, right? Because there has to be a reason that people want to use your thing in the first place, right? So you have to nail some of the basic promoting pressures in the very early phases. I then think, V1 of any product for me is very promoting pressure focused. Unless it's something in which there's already an intrinsic reason to do something, right? People intrinsically want to go from point A to point B, and so, you can rely on that intrinsic motivation. But so beginning, Very, very, very beginning, promoting pressures. Then I really over-index on inhibiting pressures. All right, now that I've got something worth using, right, there's a reason to use this, then my entire job becomes about moving everything out of the way that prevents usage, right? Then I go back to promoting pressures, and usually the reason is this. When you're at small scales, you may recognize what some of the inhibiting pressures are, but not be able to do anything about them, right? Uber's a really good example of this, right? They didn't tackle laws right at the beginning. There were laws in some places that made Uber very difficult to exist. So they didn't start there at the beginning, right? They waited until they were big enough that they could loop back onto those inhibiting pressures. So I do think there's kind of a cycle to it where we're kind of going back and forth. What has worked, we don't do it at Clover because our scale is too big. I'm running 1 million, we run, I don't know, 160 pilots a year, something like that. I mean, it's very big with like a 7-person team. So it's, it's pretty resource intensive. So we're doing everything all the time. But when I previously owned products at Microsoft and other places, there was definitely this sort of cyclic nature to it. There are also, by the way, it depends a little bit on what's going on in the market. So one of the reasons I love behavioral statements is because it reveals natural partners. If there's anybody, a CEO, BD, or business development people in the room, I actually think that behavioral statements can reveal partnerships and competitors very neatly. So for example, nobody ever really thought about the fact that Netflix and Uber were locked in a death battle with each other. Uber and Netflix were locked in a death battle with each other. Why? Well, what did Uber want you to do on Friday night? Go out and drink, right? So that you can't drive home, right? They want you to go out and get drunk so that you need an Uber to go home. Well, what does Netflix want you to do on Friday night? Stay in, right? Stay in and binge on 12 hours of really anything, right? So Uber and Netflix were locked in a death battle with each other because they wanted you to do completely opposite things, right? And so sometimes paying attention to the promoting inhibitor pressures depends a little bit on what else is going on in the market and who else I can work with, right? If Netflix wants you to stay in on Friday night, there are natural partnerships that go with that. Who else wants you to stay in on Friday night? Well, any food delivery service wants you to stay in on Friday night. That's great, right? Snuggies, right? Blankets, big screen TV manufacturers. There's an endless list of people who want you to stay in on Friday night that Netflix can go partner with, right? And in the end, they may actually change their behavioral statement, come around. The original behavioral statement of Uber was when people want to go from point A to point B. But they encountered this problem, which is at some point, they had too many drivers and not enough people who wanted to go anywhere. So they were like, well, what do we do with all these extra drivers? Well, we'll start delivering food, right? And thus Uber Eats was born, right? Well, now, instead of when people want to go from point A, it's when anything needs to go from point A to point B. And now Netflix is a perfect partner for me, right? Because Netflix wants you to stay home. I want you to stay home. I'll deliver you some food. And so as you get really big, that's why I sort of said, there's this cyclic thing to it, and the sort of amplitude of those cycles gets bigger the bigger you get, right? Because then you can make giant bets like, I'm going to change a law, or I'm going to go start delivering food, right? So you can start to take these bigger giant swings. And so one of the things I'll sort of say is I definitely think the size of company should vary your amplitude. And you want to be careful about over-rotating on one side or the other. You need to have a core belief. You need to build something that's distinctive in the market. But you have to be really careful about over-rotating early on. Does that make some sense? Any other questions? Oh, we're out of time. Never mind. Let's all go drink and then you can ask me questions.